Welcome to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain seeking a frank discussion of American education. I'm your host, Andy Nash. My guest today is Dr. Ben Novak. Dr. Novak is a 1965 graduate of Penn State, was also a student body president at Penn State from 1964 to 65, was also an adjunct professor and assistant dean of students, as well as had been elected to the Penn State Board of Trustees between 1988 to 2000. Dr. Ben Novak, welcome back to Inside Academia.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. It's great to be here.
A topic of discussion this week is student governance, not just at Penn State and major universities. Most students today, the conventional wisdom now, I'd say for a few decades, probably has been that student governance is essentially nothing more than, at the very least, a popularity contest, and at very best, perhaps a consumers advocacy group on behalf of students and student life in major universities, in which these elected student leaders will take administratively charged fees and monies and collaborate with administrators on little pet projects, supposedly to better student life. Is that all there is to be said for student governance? Was it ever different in the past?
Yes, I think student government has just become a shadow of what it formerly was. And so I think we want to talk about that. But the student government was vastly different before the 1960s. And so, but to convey that to students today, I want to put two ideas in place first, because I don't know how to create, a student body that would want to govern itself with two things in place, two ideas that are current. First is that students come here, most of them say, I'm just coming here to get my education so I can get a job. And so they're coming to the university as customers. I'm paying for an education, give me the education, and they don't feel that they're coming for anything really beyond that, except maybe to get away from their parents and extend their adolescence and have a good time for 4 years. All right? And so that's a great deal of the drinking problem and many other problems, because they're just here to get those classes, give me the grade, I don't care about learning, tell me what's on the exam so I can pass it. And this attitude is one where really alienates themselves from each other and from the university community itself. Now, the second idea I want to put in place is that right now, student government deals almost exclusively with the administration. And the entire function of student government is almost a Marxist paradigm of how do we get benefits from the governors, from the administration that runs it. They have all the money, how do we get some of their apples? So they're constantly trying to get money or facilities or benefits for the students, like a consumer union or like just begging for the administration, please give us something, all right? And they don't feel they can do anything without the administration. And the administration makes it clear, to do anything, you've got to get our permission. So they're constantly begging the administration. Now, the idea I want to pose to that existed prior to 1970 was the idea of tripartite government. That the government was divided into, the university had three governing bodies, three governing sources, and that was the faculty that ran academic affairs, courses, and curriculum. And that was the administration handled administering, doing the accounting, getting out the paychecks, going to Harrisburg, trying to get appropriations and that kind of thing, getting architects together to build buildings and so forth. And then there was the students. Well, what was the function of the students? In a word, the students were in charge of, the very character of the university, the community that was here. What was the nature of that community? How did they relate to one another? It dealt with the spirit of the university. Because how the reputation of a university back then was much more determined by what the students said about it than the credentials of the faculty. If the students were enthusiastic about their college career, then that was the advertisement for the university. The administration placed the students on a pedestal, if you will, because that was the real university. Who you were is what your students represented you to be, both when they were in the student body, how they behaved here, and then as alumni. And so the students were at the very center of things and representing the real spirit, the real idea, the real nature of the university. Now, with those ideas in place, what did we have? What we had is a change from students being the very center of the university and their experience. For example, you've heard it said that, that many students a university education is a privilege, not a right. But now they understand that, most of them say, it has been reinterpreted by many different sources, to say, okay, well, that merely meant only the rich could get it. The poor couldn't afford it. And there is, that may be true, but it had nothing to do with why they called it a privilege. They called it a privilege because when young people went to college, it was to have an experience that they would remember for the rest of their lives, and that there was something that could not be duplicated in any other part of their lives. They came behind the ivy-covered walls and the ivory tower in order to get a distance from society, to get out of society for 4 years, and create a community among themselves. And that was such an experience that everybody was jealous of anybody else that went to a university.
Penny University, going back to England a few centuries ago, had to do with the idea that for a penny you could go in and get a cup of coffee in a cafe, and you could talk about the issues of the day. And much of the same, of course, went on in pubs, and as well as colonial and revolutionary pubs. There was a spirited, meaningful conversation among people. Now, the same sort of thing happened, of course, in universities, but there was something much more that was going on in universities, as you allude to, with the character, as you say, of the student community. Now, Penn State University is a land grant going back to the mid-19th century, and so I guess the time period that you're speaking about, I'm presuming, is the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where you're talking about how students formed communities into themselves only while they were at universities. That they did nowhere else, or they wouldn't have done if they would have stayed home or gone elsewhere. So what exactly was the basis of that? What was the nature and character of that?
The first thing is the students came, and first they were to be hammered into a class. Okay, so the freshmen came, they had to wear dinks, they couldn't walk on the grass, they couldn't smoke, they couldn't date, and they were anytime an upperclassman told them to do something, they had to behave, they had to do it, okay? In other words, the idea here was to form that freshman class into unity among themselves, to realize, hey, we're all in the same boat. In other words, you're forming a community and an experience, okay? The following year, they'd be sophomores and would do it to the next year's freshmen. Mm-hmm. And then through this thing, they had a class identity, and they were very grateful that you had upperclassmen. For example, there might be 300 students here, so let's say there's 75 in each class. The 75 sophomores, hammered them into a class. And they would have the freshman, sophomore football game at the end of the year, one of the biggest events of the year. They would have the pollings where they would run out, and these were bloody things. I mean, they broke arms and legs and eyes and so forth, because it was very serious. But at the end of that, they had such camaraderie and such spirit that it was utterly amazing.
So they basically had greater loyalties and allegiances toward one another because they felt as though they were part of a class.
In other words, part of the thing is to take you, because this wouldn't happen just living in your village or your town or your city. No one would do this to you. They were rough ones. It's kind of like, think of how proud any guy who's gone through Marine training is.
Yeah.
He's gone through that. He's endured it. He's proved he's a man. He's been tough. He's been toughened up. Well, that happened at a college campus, not in exactly the same way as Paris Island.
Now,
but
can you tie that into governance? How did they then?
Because coming from that, as this could easily be organized when there are under 300 students. But as we reached the turn of the century, we started expanding and getting a lot more students. But then they wanted to get these various groups together. Now, the students, even starting in the 1880s, in fact, even in this 1860s, started creating activities among themselves. So we were a agricultural university. They wanted liberal arts, so they created their own library, okay? They created literary societies. Back in the 19th century, probably the 1880s, the Friday night literary debate was the biggest event on campus, because that's where they were, having that other part of their education that they provided themselves. And so they did this to provide these things for themselves and didn't ask it from the administration, didn't ask it from the faculty. And they created the newspaper, the football team, and as the institution grew, the Pennsylvania State College began to have a lot more students. They needed some way to coordinate all this. And also that they were going to have this across the entire student body, because they were so proud to be Penn Staters. They were so proud to be a member of their class. They were so proud of everything, the experience of being here, that, if there was somebody who didn't go along with that, and they behaved in a bad way, they would say, you don't represent Penn State, you don't represent us. So student conduct was a major reason that they were going to govern themselves, and they were going to form their own community, and they were going to create their own spirit.
Today, students who come into any university, and this is universal, not just Penn State, but you could say this about any other school, they come in with the idea, they see all these things as resources, as things that the school, meaning the administration, has to offer them as paying customers coming to get a service. So how and when, or for what reason did the idea shift? Or how did the old classical idea break down in which they come in and take ownership of all this and be proud of it? And how did it change to a consumer exchange in which I see all of these programs that you're going to offer me that I'm paying for if I'm a student?
Well, it broke down in the 60s. A whole new idea came with the boomer generation that was just reaching college. And that idea was that they were going to change the world. Okay, they cared more about politics in Washington than what was going on their own campus. They utterly changed the focus. They said what student government was doing, setting up a spring carnival, the arts festival, setting up newspaper organizations, chartering. They were in the student government at that time, chartered student organizations, and they governed themselves. And it was the all college cabinet because they brought together the heads of the major organizations, the fraternities, the dorms, the sororities, the independents downtown, and other organizations into that. And so it was a coordinating body. It was called the all college cabinet. And so it could have activities, whether it was the interfraternity sing or whether it was singing Christmas carols to the faculty on at Christmas time, putting on events of all kinds that were them, and these were fantastic events that everybody loved. This is why you wanted to be in a college town, to see the students have this spirit and exhibit it. Okay, and so then in the 60s, the radicals came through. And they thought, all this is playing in a sandbox. We want civil rights in the nation. We want to end the Vietnam War. We want to get rid of the government in Washington. They were very revolutionary at the time. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of creating a local community was the last thing they wanted to talk about. All they wanted to do was to have mass demonstrations that would get the attention of the media, force politicians or others to give in to non-negotiable demands, take over the president's office, get all the publicity and so forth on that, and that was the basic idea of it.
And what did that mean for the tripartite governance of students at the table in a major university? What did that mean for them? Well,
it meant two things. First, it meant that because we came through with the student leader that took over Columbia came out with a book, I think Jerry Rubin or something like that, and he wrote a book called "Steal This Book." And everybody was encouraged to steal from the corporation, steal from the university and everything else. So the students, where they were governing themselves and say, hey, that's not how I want the guy in the next room to act. I don't want him stealing from me. I don't want those kind of people around. People would say, don't work with the system. Okay, destroy the system. And so it didn't function any longer. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
On July 1st, 1970, the Board of Trustees voted all the powers of the university, of the faculty, senate, and the student government to reside solely in the president of the university. So all power was lodged in the administration. Another thing was the student tribunals, where students govern their own conduct and set the standards of what it means to be a Penn State student. That was taken over by the administration. How?
Right.
Because the students said, we don't want to be judged in informal things among our own peers. We want constitutional rights, criminal rights. We want trials with lawyers and everything.
Right.
This came up when I was student government president, and I argued with him. I said, look, you can get your constitutional rights and your legal rights and your lawyers, but what will happen is they're going to prosecute you, in the court system.
Right.
And then they're going to get a criminal record. And it's going to be expensive, and whereas now it's among your peers. It doesn't give you a criminal record. It doesn't destroy your future. It's just among your peers. Isn't this what we wanted? No. We want constitutional rights.
So students disciplining themselves ended up going from student-run tribunals to becoming administratively run discipline offices. Likewise, students used to be able to enact their own fees, but now, again, the trustees vote on raising tuition as well as raising fees for their projects. We only have a minute left. What were some of the attitudes or the ideas of previous Penn State administrative presidents since the time you were in school to today in terms of their attitudes?
In 1955, university commencement, we had hundreds of people here for the 100th anniversary of the university for a convocation. President Milton Eisenhower was president of Penn State, stood before this huge congregated alumni and so forth, and said, I want to introduce Jesse Arnell, the president of the student body. He says, there are two presidents of this university. The first is the president of the student body. He says, I, of course, am the second. Okay, in other words, the presidents were the student body had the primacy in terms of honors for this because they were the reputation of the university. And then this changed in the 80s when President Oswald, for example, said, well, basically when students come to Penn State, they just take the courses off the shelf and pay at the registrar. And then in the 1980s, President Bryce Jordan loved to say, well, students are just like customers of General Motors. In other words, from being an astonishing experience that students really wanted to help form themselves and to do something they couldn't do in the rest of their life, it was changed into just another cash transaction.
They come in with the idea, the tacit understanding that they're paying customers of a service, and
right.
any idea of there being a magical experience is just a at best ancillary. But we can explore again later how we could possibly crawl back to that sort of idea of a classical university. But we're just about out of time. So, Dr. Ben Novak, I want to thank you again for joining us today on Inside Academia.